Hello students and welcome to BioBytes. In today's topic, we're going to be looking at respiration from life processes, chapter 6. First, we'll start with the lime water test. So this test is to determine which type of air, normal air or the air exhaled from human beings, which has more amount of carbon dioxide. So for this experiment, you take two test tubes and take equal amounts of lime water in both of them. Lime water is nothing but aqueous calcium hydroxide. So in the first test tube, you will take a pitchkari or a syringe and you will blow air bubbles into it. While the second test tube, you will get a person to volunteer and exhale air through a straw. So observe both the test tubes and you will notice that the test tube which has the exhaled air from a human becomes precipitated with a white color faster. So what this means is that there is more carbon dioxide present in exhaled air. How this is so is because lime water is actually an indicator of carbon dioxide. So when excessive carbon dioxide comes in contact with lime water, which I told you is calcium hydroxide, the white calcium carbonate precipitate is formed. Next, let's move on to what are respiration and what are the different types of respiration. So if we were to define respiration, it's a reaction where carbohydrates are oxidized to produce energy. So the carbohydrates, namely the glucose that we obtain from the nutrition process, is now being broken down in the presence of oxygen to produce energy. So where is the site of respiration? So the mitochondria is the organelle in the cell where the respiration process is going to take place. And the end product of respiration is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cell. So respiration involves two different processes. One is breathing, which is a physical process, and the other is cellular respiration, which is a chemical process. So breathing just involves the processes of inhalation of oxygen and the exhalation of carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration can be broken down into a lot of steps. So the first step in respiration is where glucose breaks down into pyruvate. So glucose is a 6-carbon compound and it is going to break down into the 3-carbon compound pyruvate and release some energy in this process. So this first step is going to take place in the cytoplasm of the cell. So from this point onwards, pyruvate can take different pathways depending on the availability or unavailability of oxygen. So this happens in the mitochondria. So the pathway where oxygen is available is the aerobic pathway, and if oxygen is lacking, then respiration follows the anaerobic pathway. Now let's look at the aerobic and anaerobic respiratory pathways in detail. So respiration in the presence of oxygen is called aerobic respiration. Like I said, it takes place in the mitochondria. So the products of aerobic respiration are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now let's move on to anaerobic respiration. Like I said, if there is no oxygen present, this pathway is followed. So anaerobic respiration is performed by microscopic fungal organisms like yeast in the process of fermentation. So in yeast, pyruvate, the 3-carbon compound, is going to get converted into ethanol, a 2-carbon compound, and also form carbon dioxide and energy. In our muscles, in the muscles of human beings, anaerobic respiration also takes place. And here, the 3-carbon compound pyruvate is going to get converted into the 3-carbon compound lactic acid and also release some energy. So when does anaerobic respiration occur in the muscles? If our energy requirements are more than our oxygen intake, the body will have to shift from aerobic to anaerobic respiration. In the cases where we are running a marathon or a long distance race, we would need a short burst of very high amounts of energy to complete the race. So the normal amount of oxygen that we're taking with each breath will not be enough to provide the energy required. So our muscles will switch over to anaerobic respiration to make up this energy. So after the expenditure of energy is over, sometimes the lactic acid which is produced as a byproduct tends to accumulate in the muscles, causing cramps. So if you perform a very vigorous or severe exercise out of nowhere, it can lead to muscle cramps as a result of the anaerobic respiratory process. Now we'll move on to some major differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So the definition mainly differentiates one being in the presence of oxygen, which is aerobic, and one being in the absence of oxygen. And the sites for aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration are also pretty evident. Aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria, whereas anaerobic respiration occurs in the cytoplasm. The byproducts of aerobic respiration are carbon dioxide and water, whereas the byproduct of anaerobic respiration in yeast is ethanol, and in the muscles are lactic acids. Aerobic respiration releases significantly more energy, around 38 ATP molecules per cycle, when compared to just about 2 ATP molecules in anaerobic respiration. So the energy of anaerobic respiration is much lesser than aerobic respiration. And we already know the examples where aerobic and anaerobic respirations are taking place. Now we're going to look at the respiratory structures which are present in plants and animals. When we take unicellular organisms, their entire body is going to be in contact with the environment. So a simple diffusion process will be enough to take in carbon dioxide and oxygen, so on and so forth. And we have already seen in the previous concept that plants have stomata in their stems, in their leaves, in their roots, and they can perform gas exchange through the stomata. So when we come to aquatic organisms like fishes, they have the organ called gills. So gills are specialized to take up dissolved oxygen from the water. But since the oxygen amount in the water, the dissolved oxygen is at a very less quantity, fishes have a very fast breathing rate. So when we come to insects, insects have structures called spiracles on the sides of their body. So they are long interconnected tubes by which they perform gas exchange. So when we come to terrestrial organisms, they possess the lungs as the organ for gas exchange, and their breathing rate is quite lesser when compared to aquatic organisms, because terrestrial organisms take up oxygen from the atmosphere. So the amount of atmospheric oxygen is much, much higher than the dissolved oxygen present in water. So when we compare the breathing rates of terrestrial and aquatic organisms, terrestrial organisms have a very low breathing rate. Now let's look at the human respiratory system in detail. So when we observe the nose of human beings, they are called the external nostrils, which will diverge inside to form a tube called the nasal passage. Now this nasal passage is lined with mucus and hair-like structures which perform two major functions. One is to trap any microbes or dust particles in the external air, and also warming up the air. So warming up the external air helps in diffusion because warm air tends to diffuse faster than colder air. So now the nostrils will continue on to a tube-like structure called the pharynx. So the pharynx is the area where the food pipe and the windpipe, basically the trachea and the esophagus, diverge and form the digestive and respiratory systems respectively. Then the pharynx continues on towards a box-like structure called the larynx, which is the voice box. So they have vocal cords and helps us with speech. The larynx will then continue on to a long tube-like structure called the trachea, which is supported by rings of cartilage. So the purpose of these rings of cartilage is to make sure that the trachea remains upright and doesn't collapse when there is no air. So sometimes we take pauses while breathing, and there is no air in the trachea, so it must not collapse. So it is supported by the cartilaginous ring-like structures. The trachea then splits off into two bronchi, each going into the right and the left lung respectively, where it further divides into bronchioles and finally ends up as alveoli. So the alveoli are air sacs where gas exchange is occurring. So there are different factors that contributes to effective gas exchange. The first is the alveoli are very thin. Second, the surface of the alveoli is very moist. Third is they have a large surface area. And the fourth is they have numerous blood capillaries lining them. So these four reasons make gas exchange extremely effective in the region of the alveoli. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to be exchanged in the thoracic cavity by various changes to volume and pressure, which we will see in the next slide. So when we come to the mechanism of breathing, it is a physical process which can be separated into inspiration or inhalation and expiration or exhalation. So let's look at the changes that happen to the thoracic cavity during inspiration. So the thoracic cavity is the structure or the region where the lungs are present inside the ribs. So during inhalation, the thoracic cavity is going to expand. A set of muscles called the external intercostal muscles are going to contract, whereas the internal intercostal muscles are going to relax. What this does is it pushes the rib cage upward and outward. Now the diaphragm is also going to contract. So all these changes are going to increase the volume in the lungs. We all know that pressure and volume are inversely proportional. So when the volume in an area is going to increase, the pressure in that area will decrease. So what is happening now? There is low pressure inside the lungs, and outside the body in the atmosphere there is high pressure. We all know that air moves from high to a low pressure. So external air will now move into the lungs. In the process of expiration, now the thoracic cavity is going to relax. The internal intercostal muscles are going to be contracted and the external intercostal muscles are going to be relaxed. So what this does is it makes the rib cage move inward and downward. Now the diaphragm is also going to relax and return to its original dome shape. So all these changes is going to decrease the volume in the lungs. So as a result, the internal pressure in the lungs is going to increase and it is going to be more than the atmospheric pressure. So as a result, the air from inside the lungs is going to rush outside. So with that, we have come to the end of the video. If you like it, please give a thumbs up, share it, comment down below, and please subscribe to BioBytes.